Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. We can begin this week's iteration of International Macroeconomic History seminar. And this week, I'm very happy to be hosting, and I'll be introducing Louis Boussard and Jeremiah Dittmar. Louis is a candidate, I think, in the government department at LSE, a PhD candidate, and Jeremiah is Associate Professor of Economics at LSE. And they're going to be talking about pandemic shocks and economic divergence, political economy before and after the Black Death, a topic that's very close to my own research interests. And without further ado, I guess we can begin the presentation. And Louis or Jeremiah, I'm not sure which one of you are going to be presenting, or if you both are, but if you want to start sharing your screen, you can do so.
Yeah, 1 second.
And the usual rules apply. So if you put questions into the chat box, and then at the end of the seminar, I'll call on people either reading out those questions or I'll allow you to ask those questions yourselves.
Can you see the slides?
Yeah, we can see the slides.
Okay, good. Perfect. So thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for inviting us. I am very happy to present our work here. So as Mark already said, this is joint work with Jeremiah Dittmar, who is also here, and it documents the divergence of Eastern and Western Europe. So some of you may know that differences between what we conceive of as Eastern and Western Europe extend beyond mere, or more recent historical episodes and go back at least to the 16th century, when coercive labor institutions and what Friedrich Engels would call serfdom spread in the East. So we ask in this paper what drove this divergence, and we argue that the Black Death in 1350 was a critical juncture for this development. Okay. So the Black in the 1300s killed approximately 1/3 to 40% of the European population, and this constituted a massive shock to the supply of labor. Now, those who survived commanded relatively high wages, while grain prices plummeted. So the shock shifted the distribution of income away from feudal lords towards workers in cities. And the resulting conflict over the distribution of rents constituted one of the highest stakes conflicts in European history. So in Eastern Europe, it led to depressed development and eventually new restrictions on the mobility of labor. But in the West, bargaining power for labor rose and feudal institutions eroded. And the story behind this divergence, we think, is that the shock activated underlying political differences across regions. So there were underlying differences in the larger balance of powers. So territories of feudal lords in the West were way more fragmented compared to the East, where territories were more consolidated due to a prior colonization process. And in the West, this put constraints on lords, and cities thus had, relatively speaking at least, more bargaining power. And they could effectively channel their demands in some sense and take advantage of the price shock. In the colonial East, however, lords were relatively unconstrained and cities thus relatively weak. So here urban autonomy was crushed and urban trade rights and manufacturing monopolies were taken away. So we go back to this influential debate, which was set out by Robert Brenner and in Why Nations Fail, which focuses on the divergence within what is today Germany and parts of Poland, but we study cities. And here we document the rise of the self-governing city. In economics, this includes the pattern of city construction and manufacturing. And in politics, the development of major city institutions like city charters, city councils, mayors, courts, the selection rules that were governing these bodies, and acts of political action. And the main finding is that there is a relative decline in the colonial East after 1350, in economics and in politics. And the timing and the spatial pattern of this urban divergence precedes and predicts a subsequent divergence in agriculture and the adoption of coercive labor institutions. And this divergence is predicted by a historic border which follows the river Elbe and its tributary Saale and splits Germany into two parts. Here I'm showing you how the river divides our study area. East of the Elbe-Saale line is the colonial East, and to the west is the historic heartland of German-speaking Europe. And here's as a first summary statistic of our paper, we plot construction activity across colonial Eastern and historic Western cities. And the data comes from the Deutsche Städtebuch, which is an encyclopedia of over 2,200 German cities from 1200 to 1700. And we use an indicator which is equal to 1 whenever there is a major construction event in a given 50-year period. So major construction events could be, for example, the building of churches, the building of bridges, town and merchant halls, arsenals, or city walls. And if you take this construction activity as a first indicator for how dynamic, economically speaking, cities were at that time, what we see is that until 1350, colonial Eastern and historic Western cities are not only similar in terms of trends, but also in terms of levels. But when the Black Death hit in 1350, a gap opens up, and in colonial Eastern cities, construction dropped by 1/3 relative to the prior trend and the Western path. And this divergence is greatly persistent. It persists through other later macro historical shocks, like the Protestant Reformation and one of the most destructive conflicts of European history, the 30 Years' War. So what's the story behind this divergence? We argue that income changed in ways that activated politics. So again, the price of grain dropped sharply while the price of labor increased. Now, this was very bad news for lords who got much of their income from the control of agricultural production. And at the same time, this was very, very good news for cities who held monopolies in goods that were sharply rising in value. So this is important because at its heart, it means that income shifted away from landowners and feudal rulers towards cities and workers. And here we think that politics comes into play. There were underlying differences in the larger balance of power across regions. But interestingly, and I later come back to this, not necessarily in city-level political institutions, okay? But this distribution then sort of shapes what Douglas North would call the price of politics, which also, among other things, includes the bargaining power of cities vis-a-vis lords. And we try to approximate or capture this, even if we do so arguably imperfectly, with the fragmentation of the territories of feudal lords. So feudal lords had claims of sovereignty over the cities in their territory. But as you know, most of you probably know, much of the Western Holy Roman Empire was characterized by a highly fragmented political landscape. And there's a lot of research on how this type of political fragmentation was key in European history. And one, and probably the most essential aspect of this, was that fragmentation induced political competition among lords. And this made cities stronger, relatively speaking. Now, despite these stark differences on this seemingly key dimension before 1350, we find no differences in economic development before the shock. Yet when the shock hits, those differences suddenly are associated with development patterns. So this is a story, in our view, in which an economic shock activates politics as a motor for economic development. And lastly, and we think also importantly, this urban divergence was very consequential for agriculture. So because of two things, Cities, on the one hand, were very powerful. They commanded military force. They went at or waged major wars against lords, and also shaped regional institutions like diets or early forms of parliaments. So they had a direct effect in the larger political economy, but also because they shaped outside options for agricultural labor. So if you're a peasant close to an affluent city, you can leave or at least credibly threatened that you would leave if working conditions were to worsen. Okay, why were there political differences to start with? Labor was initially scarce in the East, and in the 800s still, the river still constituted the easternmost boundary of the Carolingian Empire. But then territorial rulers expanded east of the Elbe and promoted large-scale migration. Okay, and they tried to attract migrants from Western Europe as far away as Southwest Germany and the Netherlands. And they did so by offering a good deal in the form of settler institutions. And these institutions were basically imports from the West. Okay, they used Western city charters as blueprints. Yet these institutions, though they were nominally the same, were granted in a context in which territories were more concentrated. But culturally and economically speaking, as we will show, the East became part of Western Europe. So to some extent, our whole exercise is framed by the fact that what we conceive of as Eastern Europe is somewhat of a dynamic concept, right? There were areas in East Germany, in Hungary, in Poland, even some remote areas in Romania that were once considered to be part of the West. So the previous frontier now runs through the heart of the land. But the rivers still trace a border between a politically disjointed West and a colonial East that was based on rational territorial principles. So the differences were not mainly economic or social in origin, but political. How have other people thought about the boundary? So for Peter Kriete, it's the most significant socioeconomic divide in Europe. And for Robert Brenner, it's the pivotal comparative case when thinking about the expansion and decline of serfdom. It's a sharp line bisecting Germany, okay? But of course, there are differences. There are complications. Reality is not easy. It's complex. There is heterogeneity. The border is fuzzy. And there is a whole literature that suggests that the colonial East is not uniformly worse. And we will later come back and try to speak to this literature. So what evidence do we study? The first thing we gather is evidence on the fragmentation of feudal rule over individual cities. And we use that as an indicator for a broad set of political institutional differences, and first and foremost, political power. And we argue that this fragmentation induced competition among lords and thus strengthened the relative bargaining power of cities, okay? Which means that the price of politics in Douglas North vocabulary went down. And the second thing we gather is data on urban economic and political development. And we use the Deutsches Städtebuch, which is an encyclopedia of German cities, from which we gather data on over 2,200 cities over the period from 1200 to 1700. And on the economic side, we use data on construction and manufacturing activities in 50-year periods. And on the political side, we observe the development of major institutions like city charters, councils, mayors, selection rules over these institutions, but also political action, including conflicts with lords, city alliances, and the development of autonomous laws. And lastly, we collect corroborating evidence on agriculture. And here we ask, when did noble estates expand? And when did laws restricting the mobility of peasants come into play? So here again is our study area that I showed you before. And we will think about political fragmentation by looking at how claims over individual cities vary over space. So here is an example. Every dot represents a city. Every number represents a ruler. And so for each city, we draw a circle of 100-kilometer radius. And in the radius of this particular city, for example, there are 20 different rulers, which you can see on the right, who had claims over cities. And what we then do is we compute Herfindahl indices of how concentrated or fragmented the rule is in this radius. So here, for example, ruler number 4 is the false Voldemar. And he's an imposter that pretended to be the deceased Margrave of Brandenburg, who was eventually bestowed by Charles IV with approximately 1/3 of all the cities in this particular circle. So we take his ruler share, we square it 1/9, and then we repeat this exercise for every other ruler in the circle and add up all the squared ruler shares, okay? And then we have a Herfindahl index. And then we take 1 minus this Herfindahl index to get at our fragmentation measure. And as you can see, we're not imposing that there be any difference at the border, okay? So if you're a city close to the border, you will naturally have some neighbors on the other side. So if we plot political fragmentation by region, we see that the resulting distribution is bimodal. Political fragmentation is the defining features of Western cities. There is quasi no overlap with the colonial East. And let me reiterate, we do not impose a border when calculating our fragmentation measures. And this difference is arguably relatively pronounced, even if we focus on neighbors just across the border. So this table shows you basically the Eastern cross-sectional differences before 1350, and what we are doing here is basically we're just running a regression and have an indicator on the colonial East. And so what we are seeing and what we are confronted with are strong differences in political fragmentation, which might be interpreted as a distribution of lordly power vis-a-vis cities. And we not only observe this difference in the full sample, but also when restricting our attention to neighboring cities along the border, okay? And while we do find these differences at the regional level, it is important to note that we do not find differences in city-level institutions, like whether cities had charters or a council. And my interpretation is that these facts speak less to de facto differences in nominal institutions, but rather to differences in the distribution of political power, okay? Now, despite these differences in fragmentation, we do not see any differences in construction and manufacturing prior to the Black Death either, okay? Now, of course, we certainly observe other differences, including in agricultural productivity and the exposure to the plague. But these differences are attenuated and become statistically insignificant when focusing on cities along the border. And lastly, it might be important to note that, you know, cultural features were relatively similar, at least along the border, okay? Both of these regions were Germanized, and both of these regions were Christianized, okay? So to give you an idea of our analysis, we will think through 3 comparisons. So the first comparison is very simply one between a colonial East and a historic West. And the second comparison is along the border. And the third comparison is comparing neighboring cities along the border, where we are basically controlling for grid cell times fixed effects. And we will look at these comparisons with a regression model. And what we are interested in is beta 1, which is the variation in outcomes associated with being in the colonial East and how it shifts after the Black Death, okay? While we control for underlying differences in regional trends and potential time-varying confounders related to the distance to the border, to differences in rye yields, or whether an individual city was reportedly exposed to the plague. And then we run through our comparisons. And we start by looking at shifts in construction. So construction is an important sector because A, you needed capital, and B, you needed a number of supporting industries, but also because observations are relatively well dated. And across our comparisons, what we find is that construction in the colonial East drops by approximately 1/3 relative to the mean and to the prior trajectory. So in column 3, you can see that, you know, being actually exposed to the plague at the city level is associated with a negative growth trend afterwards. And this is not explaining away our east-west variation, okay? And in column 5, we are restricting our attention to cities in the same grid cell along the border. So this is our neighbors comparison. Of course, you will have questions related to the causal interpretation of our estimates. And for these estimates to be confounded, at least for the ones in column 5, any potential confounder must cause unobserved time-varying shifts in neighboring cities differentially across the border, okay? So could the shock have interacted with prior economic differences? Yes, certainly, and this is something parts of the historical literature actually mentions. But in our case, we do not find any differences in prior economic trends. And our results hold along the border, where we restrict our comparisons to places where urban density, natural endowments, and also access to transport infrastructure was similar. On top of this, any confounder related to rye suitability will be absorbed by our time-varying control, okay? A second story is that you might think that trade and the expansion of serfdom themselves are causal factors for our results. But we are going to observe the divergence among cities that are located, again, close to each other, with access to the same transport infrastructure, with the same soils before 1500. So before these large price movements on the international grain markets start, and before the emergence of coercive agrarian labor institutions. Could the local variation in the pandemic explain these patterns? Again, of course it could, but as I just showed you on the last slide, this seems not what is going on, at least in our comparisons. Could major military conflicts have driven the divergence? That's possible as well, but the geography and timing of two of the very, very big military conflicts of that time do not suggest that these are causal factors in our comparison. There is another potential confounder, if you want, that I have not discussed on the slide, which is the famine of the early 1300s. Okay, and that's sort of like more interesting because it's also a demographic shock to some extent. But A, the timing, and B, the price pattern that was associated with the famine does not suggest that this is the same thing as we're studying here. Okay, so here's a placebo exercise. Here are estimates when we shift the border further to the east and further to the west, and we realize that the divergence was actually strongest where indeed the Elbe-Saale rivers actually are. Okay. Turning to the evidence of manufacturing, we find a very similar dynamic. Here we just plot the number of manufacturing events per cities by region. So for example, we observe an iron hammering works in Pfreimd in Bavaria in 1387. So far, we have looked at more classical economic measures, but these changes are interrelated and occurring with shifts in politics. And here we're documenting the development of what Max Weber called the self-governing city. Okay, so major city institutions, including city charters, councils, mayors, courts, the selection rules over these institutions, but also collective actions, including city alliances, conflicts with lords, and the development of autonomous laws. Now, of course, the demand for these institutions does not just fall from the sky. It was clearly endogenous. And there are two abstract ways of thinking where this demand might have come from. It could have come from top down, where basically the Lord wants to develop territory, maybe increase tax revenue, and thus, sort of sets up and grants city rights to attract merchants. And this is, in some sense, the historical equivalent of what Paul Romer is advocating for today with charter cities. Okay, and then the second way where this demand could have come from is from below, and this is something that Max Weber highlights, and he says that the self-governing city in European history is something that is obtained through the seizure of power by a rising class, and makes a direct comparison to other historical episodes in which social classes seized power. And an interesting case in point is Brandenburg, where cities enjoyed relatively extensive rights before the Black Death. And one of these rights was not to have castles built near you, or to even destroy them if they were in close neighborhood. But in the 1400s, this dynamic changes completely. So the local lord cracks down on the city council, and in a last-ditched attempt, councillors try to redirect the River Spree to flood the construction site of the Lord's council. But of course, the Lord returns the favor by arresting the city councillors. So there's punishment. Existing alliances were prohibited, and the city lost its independence completely. And to trace this more systematically, we collect city-level evidence on 4 categories of political and institutional life. And here, with these graphs, we're focusing on cities along the border. And what we're seeing here is mirroring the results from earlier. We document the relative decline in political development in the colonial East after 1350, relative to the prior trend and the Western trajectory. Okay, so in the first row, we see that there is a differential increase in the emergence across major institutions. Okay, and in the second row, we see that the selection rules governing city councils, which were arguably the most important institution, changed. And there's some push towards election, but this difference emerges rather late. So in contrast, most of our variation in economic development coincides with the change towards co-opted city councils. And this means that city councils obtained the right to appoint their own successors. Okay, and just to be clear, these are by no means pro-democratic. Okay, if anything, they're sort of signaling to us that there is a city oligarchy which is entrenching their powers. Okay, we also observe a tiny push towards more guild participation in councils. Note that what we are plotting here also includes merchant guilds, not only craft guilds. And we're acutely aware that at least for craft guilds, if they were in power, this can have can be a double-edged sword for growth in cities. When we look at courts, we do not find any difference whether there was a court, but we do find differences whether the city held jurisdiction rights and whether it could appoint their own judges. And then finally, in the bottom row, we see that political action shifts. So cities in the historic West differentially form alliances, wage wars against lords, and issue autonomous laws. And these laws were sort of like their own laws and decidedly not lordly law, right? Not granted by the Lord. And some historians have interpreted them as acts of anti-lordly revolution, though they admittedly mostly regulated more profane matters. And here we confirm these results econometrically. So what we do here is we create a summary index of these 12 variables that I just showed you using dimensionality reduction via generalized principal component analysis. And then we rerun the main exercise that I showed you with construction. And again, politics drops by 1/3 relative to the prior trend and mean in the colonial East after 1350. And I'm not showing it to you here, but in column, but when we introduce, our time varying controls, including to plague exposure, what we are seeing again is mirroring the results from the construction side. So again, there is a negative trend in politics for the places that were reportedly hit by the plague. Okay. In the paper, we also report more disaggregated results that are also interesting. So taking stock, so far we have documented a divergence in economic and political development across the colonial East and a historic West. And our proposed mechanism is that the shock interacts with political fragmentation. So here we study this mechanism in more detail using variation across and within regions. Okay, and the first thing we do is we study variation and political fragmentation across regions. So we test how initial political fragmentation explains shifts afterwards. And we estimate these shifts using OLS and IV. And specifically, we use the variation of political fragmentation induced by being sort of like in the colonial East as our instrument. And the second thing we're doing is we're trying to do justice to the fact that reality on the ground was, of course, much more complex than a binary distinction between a colonial East and a historic West. And there was also variation within the colonial East that was important. There are some areas in the colonial East that, look more Western in some sense. And this first and foremost pertains to Saxony and bits of Thuringia. And here we are confronted with political fragmentation levels that are more comparable to the Western pattern. And in these regions, we do not see the same suppression of cities, and coercion in agriculture remains limited after the 1500s. Okay. So here we measure high fragmentation with an indicator for cities in above median fragmentation locations before the Black Death. And then we interact this measure with a post-1350 dummy, okay? And both the OLS and the IV estimates suggest that differences in political fragmentation is strongly and positively associated with shifts in construction and political development after the Black Death. Now, of course, a very narrow interpretation of the identifying assumption has to conclude that the exclusion restriction is evidently violated, right? So let me reiterate that our argument emphasizes the causal role of a set of political and institutional differences that were shaped by geography, but does not interpret the results in a very narrow sense that only political fragmentation mattered. Okay, within colonial East variation. So in this table, we document that political fragmentation in Saxony and Thuringia was actually closer to the Western level, both in the full sample and in the border sample. Okay. And importantly, in these regions, the extent of coercive labor institutions we observe after 1500 remains limited. So this begs the question how these regions responded differentially prior to 1500. Here is a map showing you what we consider the Eastern core and Saxony and Thuringia, respectively. And this table represents regression estimates where we basically replace the colonial East times post-interaction by a sub-region within the colonial East times post-interaction. And we find that in Saxony and Thuringia, where political fragmentation was more Western, the divergence was attenuated. Okay, but in the core regions of the colonial East, there was a stark decline. And this divergence is significant before 1500. Again, this time is not chosen at random, but this is before restrictions on the mobility of labor kick in. And we think that this qualifies debates about the divergence in agrarian development. So in these debates, several important observations and arguments have been made. One is that the expansion of estate agriculture by nobles developed in colonial Eastern territories. The second argument in the literature is that the restrictions on the mobility of peasant farmers were really crucial, not only for agriculture, but also for cities, because they possibly might have had negative spillover effects. Okay. And the third argument is that all of this reflects, the pattern of rural class struggle, which includes peasant revolts. And this is basically Robert Brenner's argument. And in what little time I've left, I'll show you three types of evidence on these three issues. Let me start with evidence on the development of estate agriculture in villages in Brandenburg, which was a large and important region in the colonial East. And we find using village data over time, we find that the expansion of estate agriculture only kicks in the later 1500s. Okay, this is when the relative price of grain rises due to the international demand coming from London and coming from the lowlands. Okay, so of course this timing is very consistent with an argument that suggests that international trade is really important, and that's of course something that we don't want to rule out, and wouldn't rule out. But what we're saying is just that all of this happens against the backdrop of a divergence in the urban sector, which we observed earlier. And the urban divergence also precedes major laws restricting the mobility that mostly start also in the 1500s. Now, these mobility restrictions are probably seen as the key marker of serfdom, okay? And of course, one caveat is that these territorial laws, might have appeared after facts on the ground already changed. The last piece of evidence is the timing and the geography of peasant revolts. So existing evidence from Bierbrauer on peasant revolts suggests that there were few before 1500, and especially that there are no such revolts in our border sample. Okay, so all but one revolts are happening south of Frankfurt am Main. So we're talking about Switzerland, we're talking about Alsace. Of course, this is not to suggest that there were no other acts of resistance, like running away or lawsuits. But we find changes in the urban sector before major conflicts between peasants and lords, before the expansion of noble estate agriculture, and before formal mobility restrictions kick in. Let me conclude. We showed that the Black Death indeed was a critical juncture for the development of Eastern and Western Europe, and in particular, one in which cities moved first. So this suggests to us that cities might have been very important in shaping the larger political economy. Okay. And again, the fact that the timing and the spatial pattern of this urban divergence precedes and predicts the subsequent changes that we observe in agriculture is certainly consistent with classic social science stories, including Max Weber, Karl Marx, and Perry Anderson, which view cities as prime movers of European development. Okay, and lastly, we document the case in which politics does not matter transhistorically for economic development. So despite having key differences in politics, there's no difference in economic development prior to 1350. Okay, and only after the shock hits, these differences then are associated with differences in economic development. So this is sort of like a very important setting in which historical legacies do not persistently shape economic activity, but instead return to shape development when supply and demand shift. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Louis. So we have plenty of time for questions, and I've got some questions, but there is some in the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, you can write it in the Q&A or raise your hand, and I can either read it out or I can just ask you to raise it if you want, and I'll unmute you. So that's for everybody in the audience. So Michelle Lepetit has a few questions in the chat box, so I'll read them in reverse order. So one is they're asking, was slavery still possible in historical Germany in 1348? Because so they're thinking about prior trends in serfdom. Like, were there prior differences in serfdom, I guess, between the West and the East? That's the first question, which I can let you answer.
It's a very important question, and I think it's very, very important to understand that before the Black Death, feudal rents, where there is evidence for it, were actually lower in the East. Okay, so these settlers in the East faced little to no labor obligations and held land with favorable hereditary rights and were also personally free. Okay, and this is all due to the fact because lords had to induce migration from Southwest Germany and the Netherlands, and they did so by offering a quite a good deal. So if anything, right, like the position of both peasants, but also citizens in terms of property rights, if you want so, looked better at the eve of the Black Death.
And it's a related, so the same person, Michelle Lepetit, as I say, similar actually related point, which might be relevant, which is but goes the other way, which is to say, like, are there any? Obviously, I understand your econometric strategy, but they're raising the point that all the big cities in Germany, Cologne, Nuremberg, Magdeburg, Lubeck, they're saying it all west of the Elbe.
Lubeck
is
definitively in the east, and Magdeburg is literally on the border.
Okay, so, yeah. Yeah, that was the audience. I was wondering if that was the case. So there are and Lubeck is Hanseatic League city before the plague as well, right? Yeah. So there are the urban development is balanced in terms of size of cities, east and west, or.
So let me jump in if it's appropriate. So this is a great question. So the fact that one of the cities is east is not the crux of the matter. Like, the real question is the pattern of urbanization, the whole landscape of society radically different before. And certainly, as like Luis has shown you, far from the border, there are some differences, although not in urban density. But in many ways, and Luis, you can sort of take the baton along the divide, and especially when we compare near neighbors, we're presenting evidence that we think speaks like quite strongly to comparability.
Great. And so I've one more. Let me just get through, because there are a lot of questions now. So Arnaud Dessau asks if Protestantism could be a potential confounder for your results.
Jeremiah, do you want to answer this?
Well, Protestantism emerges after 1517, and one of the tables shows that there's already a discernible divergence beforehand, before 1500. And we use that result to show that the divergence precedes the major changes in agriculture, but by the same token, it shows that the divergence precedes this huge upheaval in religion. And Luis also showed you that like there are sort of gyrations in some of the economic changes like construction that happen during the Protestant Reformation and then during the 30 Years' War, which is obviously a religiously inflected conflict, but that this difference carries on. And again, we're asking you to think about comparisons along the river among near neighbors. So the story there isn't somehow like a cleavage between Protestant and Catholic Germany. It's between these near neighbors who had these different political trajectories.
Simone Veig has a question, so I've given her permission to talk. So, Simone, do you want to ask a question?
Sure.
It's related to this point.
Can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering if the authors think that there was any significant impact from this 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which was, about religious conflict. And also, I'm thinking, in some parts of Germany, mortality rates were very, very high from that 30 Years' War. Or do the authors think, do Lewis and Jeremiah think that the institutions were already baked in, they're already in place? That's how it's related to previous question.
So regarding the first question, the 30 Years' War. So I guess the main results still hold, and I could give a similar answer to what Jeremiah just said regarding the Protestant Reformation, right? The 30 Years' War happens from 1618 to 16 to the second half of the 1600s, and this is much later, before we document this divergence between the historic West and the colonial East. Now, there certainly might have been, some interesting interactions between what you observe in terms of dynamics of state building, etc. But after the World War, after the 30 Years' War, and our divergence, and one could be, in some sense, that the dependency of the state that comes out of the 30 Years' War and which is about to unify Germany is sort of like very dependent upon this political case called the Junkers, right? Which were all to some extent, children of this divergence, right? Regarding this is a more concrete answer to your second point regarding the differences in mortality. So in our appendix, we sort of like try to get at this question about whether the intensity of plagues mattered. Okay, and to do so, we're sort of like looking at two types of evidence. The first evidence is mortality rates, where we actually observe them. Of course, like this data is not very systematic in some sense. And the other data that we are looking at is desertion rates across places. And for both of these data, one is from Christakos, the other one is from Kaiser, and we find no significant differences in Black Death mortality across Eastern and Western regions of German-speaking Europe. Okay, and there's of course another question about the extensive margin, right? And there's sort of like we actually go on and gather new data, so to say, on whether there was actually a plague or not. And we find basically that at least when we focus on along the border, there do not seem to be any differences, okay? But there seem to be differences across regions at large. And this is sort of like also, you know, also certainly consistent in some sense with what has been, you know, what kind of evidence has been published recently on sedentary pollen evidence that basically suggests that the overall impact in the East seems to have been somewhat attenuated. But this, again, does not play a role for us when we focus on the border, right? And if anything, we are controlling for you know, being directly exposed to it.
Let me I have one question, or one set of questions I want to ask, and there are at least two more from the audience. So let me jump in with mine first, at least, which is to say, what I would like to see, I guess, in the paper, if it's at all possible, is some more explicit real wage price story, because there's a literature about how in Poland the landlords didn't just benefit in the sense that you know, the wage workers were less scarce, but also they're benefiting from the fact that there's been a big economic shock in Western Europe. So people are richer in the West, and they've switched to pastoral agriculture. So people in England and France and the Netherlands, particularly, when even the Netherlands, are demanding grain from Poland. So it's the beginning of this east-to-west grain trade. And so I don't know what's available, and I know finding this type of data is very hard, but something about the way that the prices of real wages, but also the prices of goods might have been moving in such a way to generate the patterns you're observing, say in the political changes or the changes in construction, would really, for me, tie it together as kind of a price story as well as an institutional change story. I don't know if that's possible.
So this is a request that we like welcome and sort of share. So like there's a question sort of strategically and in terms of scholarship, how you broach this given the available wage and price data. So there's relatively rich data on the cost of capital, including the rents, the annuity prices that cities had to pay on their borrowings, which we show did shift across regions. That's not part of the presentation. In terms of real wage data that's very scarce and not available at the sort of geographic and temporal granularity that we are sort of exploring for this paper. And as a result, like we sort of invoke it illustratively in an appendix. But like the point is like, you know, really, really great. And we 100% share it. And thinking about how we can potentially address it a bit more is something we'll definitely do.
I have two more questions in the queue, or at least two questions. So Ulfi, I'm going to mispronounce your surname. Ulfi has two questions, which are kind of similar, asking about comparisons between the Black Death shock and a recent COVID-19 shock, and also whether or not that can create divergences between advanced countries and in terms of inequality, immigration, and so forth. And I'll let you take that, but there's also another one I wanted to raise, which is David Mitchell's question, where you might want to also pick up on, where he's saying he wanted a clarification about why you think the Black Death brought to life the political fragmentation and constraint effects. Why he's asking for, I don't know, more explication on why the Black Death would have these consequences for, say, political fragmentation.
So, I mean, David's asking us about the very opening of the talk. So our argument is that the Black Death was writ large a price shock and shifted income across groups in society, notably towards cities and away from lords, and that there was an attempt to claw back both rents and control. as a result of the decline in income notably suffered by people whose main asset was land, like the feudal ruler. So the negative shock turned them to politics, and the underlying differences in the political landscape become salient in a new way when a sort of like prior cooperative equilibrium breaks down. So previously they were inducing people to the east with a good deal, and suddenly they're effectively reneging on this because of the price shock. You could elaborate if you feel like, Luis, or you can.
No, I mean that's true, and you sort of like see that that lords try to compensate, you know, these losses in the income distribution in various ways, and one way is like literally, if you look at, for example, the Neumark in the colonial East, lords are trying to, you know, take away trade rights, take away profitable milling and water rights from cities. They're trying to get at the manufacturing monopolies, yeah, in the same way as they're trying to, in some sense, you know, restrict the mobility of peasant farmers, which first they try to do so by instituting maximum wages, which some historians say were not very effective, because one possibility is that peasant farmers could just like migrate into cities, right? And there's this sort of like this famous aphorism called Stadtluft macht frei, so city air makes free, where when you were migrating into a city and you stayed in the city for 1 year without your lord calling you back, then you were basically personally free. And this was of course problematic for lords. And so in some sense, what we're also observing here is what Luis in the 50s has, you know, observed for the incentives of capitalists. Okay, and this is sort of like to try to reduce the outside option, you know, in order to keep wages down. And there is some similar dynamic, or at least incentive, for lords going on here. And let me just
Louis, Nathan Sussman has raised his hand, so why don't we give him coming close to the hour, we should let him ask a question, I think. I assume it's, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Great paper and presentation. So I'll be short. Two quick questions, comments. One is, did you look at the population statistics of the various cities? So you look at construction and other things, but you know, a natural thing to look at is what happens to population as an indicator of some kind of other, maybe some other variables that are operating in the background. And the second thing is just more of a kind of a marketing or positioning of the paper. But why do you call it East versus West? Because in the West as well, I mean, we had in the, like in France, and I think it was an earlier question about this. So royal power became much stronger. So it's not the nobility, it's not the same, maybe not the same way as Eastern Europe, but we do see a decline in the independence and autonomy of cities in England and in France, and riots in England, and etc. So there is this, so yeah, just in terms of framing, so it's East versus West Germany, but it's not necessarily Western Europe versus Eastern Europe at this juncture.
Louis, before you answer that, let me just, I'm gonna just mention next week's event, partly because I'm gonna have to leave the day, then I'll let you answer Nathan's question, which I thought was very good. So just before everyone in the audience heads out, next talk is in 2 weeks' time on October 26th, and it's entitled "Hot Money Inflows and Bank Risk Taking: Germany from the 1920s to the Great Depression" by Natasha Postovlny of LSE and Stephanie Collet of Deutsche Bank. And you know, that'll be in October 26th, same time. And so hopefully see many of you there. And then Louis, Jeremiah, and anyone in the audience who wants to stay can do so. I'm going to be leaving at the day, but other people can stay and continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Yeah, I guess we can moderate. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
I'll do population. So population does sort of pose a challenge in two regards. The first is that we simply don't have population records for many of our sort of cities in this time frame. So they're called cities, but many of them are in size, extremely small settlements of a few hundred people sometimes. In addition, during the Black Death and immediately afterwards, there were also some like challenges in just record keeping. So sometimes like the cities that experienced particularly devastating outbreaks of the pandemic have like either no records or highly mismeasured records. So it's something we can look at, but we would be looking at like a limited slice of the larger sample if we look at population.
Regarding your last question, I think it's probably on the one hand a very interesting question to think sort of like about the external validity, but also an incredibly challenging question. So the very you know a very cautious answer would be that what we are looking at is, again, you know, like the decline in serfdom within German-speaking Europe, okay? Which it's in itself, I think, like a subject that is worth to study. Now, you know, going into the realm of the speculative, it's interesting to think, you know, what are the conditions in France and England, and how do they differentiate themselves from what is going on in German-speaking Europe. I think probably one of the large stylized facts that have to be sort of like in some sense accommodated by any argument is that A, serfdom declines in France and in England after 1350, and B, this happens in areas that, at least on the dimension that we observe, were not as politically fragmented as you know, the west of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. Now, there are multiple ways how you could sort of like resolve this puzzle, and one way could be to think that, you know, lords were in some other way already constrained in England and France. Okay, so in England there was, you know, it's sort of like there was the Great Charter. In France, you know, like there were charters giving to various different regions, to the Normans, to the people of Languedoc, to the Bretons, to the Burgundians, etc., and so forth, right? And in England there was a parliament, and in France there were provincial estates in some sense, right? So also, if you think about England, and that's also interesting, right? It's like there's like ultimately all the land is owned by the king, right? So like these overmighty lords that we were studying in the Holy Roman Empire context, they could not draw justification from the system, right? Because if they would do so, this is sort of like they would commit treason in some way. Okay. Now, this is one possibility, that what our story is actually about is constraints on the executive, and they can come in one form or they can come in another form. Another possibility is that there were basically, let's say, two equilibria. Okay, so one where you have basically a relatively high degree of prior state centralization, and there is sort of like you know, they sort of like one key dimension, probably, I would speculate, is that, you know, taxation is not feudalized in England and in France as it is in the Holy Roman Empire. And so they're not entirely, so basically the state is not entirely dependent upon powerful lords. So that's one equilibrium. And the other equilibrium is that if you don't have, you know, sufficient prior state capacity, then fragmentation actually matters. So, okay, so high fragmentation in some sense, or high fragmentation of feudal territories, becomes the second best option in this particular world. But let me say, like, this is purely speculative, and I certainly know too little to answer this in, you know, some more definitive way. But it's a very interesting and incredibly challenging question.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to put you on the spot on this, but it's just, you know, in terms of clarifying the, I mean, the East West versus Europe, you know, East versus West Germany under some, I think I tend to agree with you that this is the lack of political centralization beforehand makes a difference in the effect of fragmentation on these outcomes. And so I think we have two raised hands. So one is Elias Artos. Let me unmute him. So Elias, you want to?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Vielen Dank for your presentation. Good afternoon from Greece. And let me ask you a little bit risky question. In your presentation, you use as a subject the German-speaking territory, let's say. Okay, Germany and the northwest of Poland. Instead of that territory, could you use the Austro-Hungarian Empire? And I think those for three reasons. First of all, the the official language was the German, although in some places they spoke Hungarian, Romanian, Serbian, etc., etc. There was the river, the Danube River, and you can, how can I say? And there are a lot of religions inside the population of the Habsburg Empire, so you can absorb, you can notice the difference based on the region. And of course, on average, the Austria was the west part of that empire, the industrial part of the economically developed part of the empire, and the Hungary, on the other hand, was the agricultural, the least economic development part of that empire. Thank you very much.
This is a challenging and hard one, I think. And I mean, I think it's meritorious. Essentially, if I understand, I'm following you. Like, this is thinking about other differences that we could explore, including like religious ones, along a different domain in another part of Europe, which like we completely take could be like a really fruitful line of inquiry. And that's just, I guess, not the research question we've set ourselves, but potentially really fruitful.
If I may jump in, another question, which is related to this literature, which is related to the Black Death and the sort of the rise of the Renaissance, or in Western Europe, is, and that may relate to your construction projects, is the fact that wealthy cities ex ante that were wealthier because of the Black Death had a large concentration of wealth, and this could be spent on public building, put this hard times and investment in art and culture and whatever. So is there an underlying difference in terms of wealth concentration, for instance, ex ante, exposed, between the East and the West, that facilitates construct? I mean, I'm talking about the construction now, in terms of the, you said the people died, but the money didn't, and then you have this. So that's a big thesis in explaining what happened in Western Europe, at least in Italy and Flanders and so forth, in terms of construction after the Black Death, which is paradoxical with the economic decline or stagnation.
So that's again like a question we could think about exploring, that obviously we hasn't been front and center in what we shared so far. Because the emphasis in what we presented was on establishing a comparison among comparable cities that were in different political dispensations when the shock hit. But you could certainly equally think about the extent to which, like, underlying wealth either differentiated cities in the East and the West, and that would have been especially the case far from the border. Or you could think about whether underlying wealth differentiated cities like within the East and within the West, and that initial quasi-endowment may have shaped how they responded. Like relative to Robert Lopez and a number of other commenters, like sometimes it's suggested that the evidence from Italy shows like city walls weren't being expanded. Like we're going back to the literature from the 1950s here, that city walls weren't expanded in the wake of the Black Death. But certainly in Central Europe, there's some strong evidence of an increase in construction right after the Black Death. So like that survivors had per capita more wealth, that they, for both economic and cultural reasons, which maybe connects to investment in culture in hard times, that they were interested in and willing to commit actually quite substantial resources to building, municipally significant edifices. And so there's a number of, like in the paper, we discuss a number of major churches and other structures in significant Western cities that were begun in the early period right after the Black Death. And we don't see sort of a parallel development in the East. And that's what we focus on, but we certainly could think about the differences that your question suggests. It's sort of nice to think about. So like, we thank you for that, and we'll turn it over in our heads.
If I may add, like that's a very good question. And regarding the construction sector, it squares actually, or potentially could square well with one of the works of Mark. So basically, the shock, the Black Death shock, in some sense, because it rose bargaining, or because it increased bargaining power for labor, was also a problem for lords socially, or for for upper classes socially, right? Like, because now the income distribution was in some sense compressed. And Alfani, for example, shows this in his work, that the Black Death reduced overall inequality. And so you could think of some types of construction, like important private dwellings, as actually introducing another socially differentiating factor, right? That this is sort of like becomes now a prestige building in some sense, or the building of a church, and in another way, regarding like the general suggestion to research inequality in more detail, it's just that like the available data doesn't, like what Alfani, Schaff, and Gierok have gathered, doesn't allow for the comparisons across time and space that we do. They basically have, I think, like 1 or 2 cities in the East, which includes Quedlinburg, but like, yeah, we basically cannot run the same types of, we cannot ask the same types of questions with the available data.
Thank you. So I think we have a couple minutes, and I see no more hands up. So unless Rui wanted to maybe ask a question, but if not, we can end it at this point. There's Rui popping up.
No, I don't need to ask any question. I think it's a fantastic research and great presentation. So thanks very much for bringing it to the seminar.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah,
and for the questions and the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was definitely a very lively crowd with a lot of questions, and very interesting work. So
so come again.
Come again.
Thank you, guys.
Have a nice day, evening.
Have a nice
Evening,
Bye.
morning.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.